in the past, there essentially in the last decades, 60 years, the frequency of major heat waves has been increasing in the Midwest. And so, for example, in July 2011, 132 million people across the U.S. were under a heat alert. And on July 20th of that same year, the majority of the Midwest experienced temperatures over 100 degrees. So that's really hot, and that can certainly cause deaths. So economic impacts historically have been severe. So there's a lot of agriculture in the Midwest. We're an extremely important economic area in terms of growing crops. You might know about the corn we grow. And so having heat waves like this that are increasing in frequency can be really damaging to crops and can be really damaging to the economic engine of our area. And then in addition to that, what is more important is that there are a lot of health concerns for humans when there are these heat waves. So a lot of people die. So for example, in 2006 to 2011, 462 people died due to heat. So that's essentially a completely avoidable death. And in total, extreme heat from 2005 and 2008 cost almost $9 billion. So crop loss, economic loss, a lot of unnecessary loss of lives, and overall high costs. Unfortunately, this is not predicted to get any better in the future. So in this first map, by 2050, the average temperature is projected to increase across the Midwest. The frequency of days above 95 will increase, and there will be fewer frost days and cooling degree days. So that means that it's highly likely that heat waves will increase in frequency. So we're going to go a little bit deeper into this. Augustine is going to explain these maps.
I can explain this. So what we're looking at here are two metrics on this. One is the dots next to major cities in the Midwest, and the dots represent the number of heat waves similar in severity to Chicago 1995, which was approximately a $9 billion heat wave. And then we're looking at the color gradient here shows the number of days over 95 degrees in the largest city. So this is the past. We've had about one heat wave a year in Chicago and St. Louis. But looking into the future decades, we're going to see a sharp increase in heat waves, especially in St. Louis, possibly 6 per decade. So almost every other year, we're going to be seeing heat wave in St. Louis, and between 40 and 50 days over 95 degrees in Missouri. Then things are only going to get worse as the century progresses. By the end of the century, we're going to see St. Louis is essentially uninhabitable, having a heat wave every year.
So this is really extreme, and this is something that we really need to be proactive about to mitigate. There is a huge capacity, as he said, in St. Louis and other places for loss of life. So this graph is showing the potential for deaths, so projected future number of heat wave deaths per year with our current infrastructure. So with a lower emission scenario, lower than we are currently, our current trajectory, there will be approximately 300 to 1,500 per year. And so this line right here is showing the 1995 heat wave, the number of deaths for that heat wave. So almost certainly we will exceed that every year. In a middle emission scenario, this even increases to 300 to 2,500 per year, also exceeding the 1995 heat wave. And then lastly, a high emission scenario will undoubtedly exceed that number with 500 to 3,000 heat deaths per year. So what can we do to mitigate this? There's a lot of social and economic things that can be done. So for one, cooling centers. Existing infrastructure can be used for cooling centers. It will not be extremely costly to create plans for when a heat wave comes, where are we going to have a cooling center, and who will be facilitating that. Cooling awareness programming is also really important. So targeting those kind of at-risk groups people who are low income don't have air conditioning, people who have medical risks such as asthma, and then elderly people. And then also changing urban building codes to reflect this hotter future so that we can create spaces that will be safer in these possible heat waves. And then lastly, adapting agriculture to be able to withstand these temperatures and this change in heat and in different types of extreme events. So second, we'll talk about floods. Our kind of reference is the Cedar Rapids flood of 2008 in Iowa, and so a series of large storms caused the Cedar River to crest its highest ever level. As you can see here, it was a huge flood. It covered 10 square miles, which was about 14% of the city, and approximately 10,000 people were displaced. So this was almost $9 million in damages in all of Iowa. That's a lot of money for a small state, a small agricultural state, for Iowa to withstand in 1 year. So in the past, you can see from 1900 to 2000, the frequency of, the precipitation departure from average has increased. Essentially, there is more precipitation as the century has progressed. And so there's a 34% increase in floods in the Midwest, corresponding to this increase in precipitation. And there have been major floods many years since the early 90s. So historically, this has caused a lot of costs, including damage to water quality and infrastructure, increased insurance costs due to flooding, damages to agriculture, so $6 to $8 million annually due to just precipitation in crop damages, unnecessary deaths during floods, and also every single flood is extremely costly to clean up. So water damage in houses and in buildings and public spaces is really expensive, and the city or the state has to spend a lot of money to make those repairs. So in the future, it is projected that the frequency of one-day heavy precipitation events will increase by 2100, as seen on the top graph, and longer 7-day heavy precipitation events, which may be more likely to cause flooding on this bottom panel, are also projected to increase by 2100. So thus there is a high likelihood of having more flooding. And this is another way to look at that. The first map shows that average precipitation will increase by up to 4 inches in certain areas of the Midwest, and the frequency of heavy precipitation will also increase. So think of precipitation that will cause flooding. The wettest 5-day total will become wetter, so the wettest 5-day total definitely has a capacity to include a flood, and if that becomes wetter, that magnitude of flooding is larger. And then lastly, a combination of the consecutive dry days are increasing, so it will be a lot drier, but then also there's this increase in precipitation, and a combination of that creates like a wonderful combination to have perfect conditions for flooding. So we need to be thinking about mitigation steps for this. So working on water quality infrastructure to make sure that it is impermeable to flooding, working on certain types of flooding barriers in cities to prevent as much damage as possible, and also changing the way that we build infrastructure and do landscaping so that our cities are more permeable and that they can kind of withstand flooding in large amounts of water better. So lastly, I'll talk about tornadoes. This is the Joplin, Missouri tornado of 2011. It was the highest scale tornado, EF5, that hit Missouri in 2011 and caused 161 deaths. So this was the deadliest single tornado ever, and well, not ever, but since we have been recording tornadoes in 1950, and that caused $3 billion in damages, which may be the most costly tornado on record as well. So since 1950, when we started measuring, the frequency of tornadoes has increased, and that may be due to just a better ability to record them, but even so, we have measured an increase. And so, zooming into 2000 to 2015, there doesn't seem to be a clear trend, but we did see a clear trend on that longer time scale. You can also see, so the top line, the green line, shows the number of tornadoes, and it kind of seems to fluctuate, but the bottom line shows the number of deaths, and that large spike is the tornado in Joplin in 2011. So we will be seeing more spikes like that. And then this histogram shows frequency of tornado severity. So 0 on the F scale is a very low, not a very severe tornado, and 5 is the most severe tornado. And so you see a very high frequency of small tornadoes, which can also be damaging in those isolated areas in someone's farm or some small town or even in cities. And so a total of 4,711 tornadoes happened in that 15-year period with 392 deaths. So in the future, it's difficult to really concretely predict tornadoes, but warming causes atmospheric instability and thus results in more severe weather. The models show an increase in the number of days with high severe storm potential, and also suggest that conditions that form tornadoes, so moisture, instability, lift, and wind shear, will increase. So you can see that in some of these graphs. The top panel shows, so spring, summer. Top panel shows convective available potential energy. So essentially the energy in the atmosphere to form a storm in the Midwest, that's increasing. Second is vertical wind shear, also conducive to tornadoes, increasing in the Midwest. Mean surface specific humidity, also changing. And lastly, essentially the number of days with high severe storm potential are also increasing in the Midwest. So it's very likely that there will be more tornadoes in our region. So what can we do to mitigate this? Build infrastructure that can withstand tornadoes, so houses and also city infrastructure, and then tornado shelters. A lot of people's houses are not safe in tornadoes, so creating a system where there are tornado structures and there are shelters and people can go there to be safe. And then also, tornadoes are a little bit difficult to predict, and so we need to invest in better predictive technology so that we can give people better warning. People have more time to then go to these tornado shelters and be safe so that we can avoid these pretty unnecessary deaths by tornadoes. So we ask you, what action will you take for hazard preparedness in the Midwest? So there's a couple of options here. 1, do nothing. So this will be a high overall cost, high future cost, but a low initial cost. Since you're not doing anything right now, there's no cost. But as I have explained through this presentation, all of these storms will increase in frequency, and then we will be paying in the future for those damages. Additionally, because we did not do any mitigation, there will be a high potential loss of life that is completely unnecessary. So the second choice is to invest significantly in mitigation, as I had discussed before. So there will be a high initial cost to make those changes in infrastructure, make those changes and implement programs, but then a low overall cost because there will be less damage in the future, and also there will be a much smaller potential loss of life.
Okay, Dragon Team. Freeze the population.